Hi, this is Grandpa Chuck. I get to read you a story called Hind's Feet on High Places by Hannah Hernard. In the village of Much Trembling. This is the story of a young girl named Much Afraid who learned to trust the chief shepherd. It is the story of how she left her fearing relatives and went with the shepherd to the high places where perfect love gets rid of fear. Much Afraid lived in a peaceful little white cottage in the Valley of Humiliation. She had many friends who lived in the same village as she did. Many of her neighbors in the village of Much Trembling worked for the chief shepherd. For several years, Much Afraid herself had been in his service. She loved her work and really wanted to make the shepherd happy, but in her heart, Much Afraid worried. She worried about her crippled body. Her feet were so crooked that she limped and often fell as she went about her work. She also worried about her mouth. It too was so crooked that it was hard for her to speak clearly. Much Afraid felt that she would not be very pretty. More than anything else, Much Afraid wanted to be beautiful, graceful, and strong, like so many of the shepherd's other workers. In fact, she wanted to be like the chief shepherd himself. But she was afraid that would never be possible. There was another, even greater trouble in her life. Much Afraid was a member of the family of Fearings, and her relatives lived all over the valley. She could never get away from them. Much Afraid was an orphan, and had grown up in the home of her poor aunt, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. Dismal Forebodings means always being afraid and worried about all the terrible things that might happen. So, Much Afraid had lived with her aunt and her cousins, Gloomy and Spiteful, and their brother, Craven Fear. Craven means very afraid. He was a bully who always did mean things to Much Afraid. The family of Fearings hated the chief shepherd and were very upset that Much Afraid was one of his servants. They kept trying to make her quit working for him. Then, one awful day, her relatives came to the cottage where Much Afraid lived and announced that she was to marry Craven Fear. What a horrible idea! She should have ordered them to leave her cottage at once, but poor Much Afraid listened to her fearing relatives. She just sat cowering before them, repeating again and again that nothing would ever make her marry Craven Fear. When they finally left her alone, it was early evening. Suddenly, Much Afraid thought of something that made her feel happier. The chief shepherd would be bringing his flocks of sheep to the watering place beside the village. Much Afraid met him there every morning to learn his wishes for the day, and again in the evening to give him her report of the day's work. Still shaking with fear, she came to the pool where the shepherd was waiting for her. She told him what her family of Fearings had said. "What can I do?" she cried. "They can't really make me marry Craven Fear, can they?" "Oh, it is bad enough to be Much Afraid. I couldn't stand to be Mrs. Craven Fear for the rest of my life." "Don't be afraid," the shepherd said gently. "You are in my service, and if you trust me, they will not be able to force you." He paused for a moment, then continued, "Much Afraid, you should never have let your fearing relatives into your cottage. They are enemies of the king whom you serve." "I know, oh I know," cried Much Afraid, "but whenever I meet any of my relatives I feel so weak. As long as I live in the valley, I will keep meeting them. They are everywhere. Now I will be too afraid to leave my cottage." Much Afraid looked across the valley and river to the beautiful mountains. She cried out with all her heart, "Oh, if only I could leave this valley and go to the high places. The Fearings and my other relatives could never reach me there." To her great surprise, the shepherd answered, "I have waited a long time to hear you say those words, Much Afraid. It would be best for you to leave the valley and go to the high places. You need to live in the kingdom of love. No fears of any kind are there because perfect love gets rid of fear." Much Afraid stared at him in amazement. "Go to the high places," she exclaimed, "and live there? Oh, if only I could!" For months I have been thinking about it, day and night, but it's not possible. I could never get there. I'm too crippled." She looked down at her crooked feet, and her eyes filled with tears. The mountains were so steep and dangerous. I have been told that only deer can move on them safely. That's enough for now. Talk to you later. I love you.